over the next 10 years to cover the cost of rectifying work on buildings where developers cannot be traced. Steve Day is founder of the Polluter Pays campaign. Good evening to you, Steve.
Good evening.
Hello, Steve. Remind us of your situation in terms of cladding on your building and how you feel about the news today.
Well, yes, it's definitely a positive step forward. My situation, I'm based in South London and Royal Artillery Quays, and we were faced with £31,000 per flat cladding bills and, in the thousands for non-cladding costs. And our service charge doubled from £3,000 to £6,000 a year. And, that put a lot of strain over the mental health of many of my 1,000 neighbours. And, it seemed very unjust because we were the innocent parties in all of this. So the government proposals are $2 billion for the builders to fix their own buildings, which we welcome, and $3 billion in the form of a levy to raise funds for those buildings where there is no developer in business, and that's for businesses of all heights, which we welcome. However, our concern is that these funds won't be enough money to cover the buildings that don't have builders in business, these orphan buildings. And in that situation where the builder, the landlord and the freeholder all don't have the money, or in the case of leaseholders that have bought the freehold, that freehold company doesn't have the money, then there won't be enough money to fix the buildings and leaseholders will be left in limbo. And bizarrely, in this situation, the land that the flats are on will escheat to the Crown and drag the Crown estate into it. And leaseholders that are angry that the Crown estate don't have a management responsibility to fix these buildings that are in limbo could blame the Queen on her Jubilee year. So we're looking at a very difficult situation if these funds aren't enough. And what I'm campaigning for, one last sentence.
Go for it.
What I'm campaigning for, because we want to put a solution in, we don't want to just talk about the problem. Our solution is, instead of the landlord backstop, which is basically where all the money goes, where it needs to be funded, being on the landlords that don't have the money, or these enfranchised leasehold companies, we say put the wide construction industry levy, extend it so it covers all costs, and put that into the backstop. And what we're asking Michael Gove and Lord Greenhow to do is to put a small amendment in a ping pong to make the construction industry pay and stop the escheat risk, protect the Queen and the Crown estate from negative publicity, and protect leaseholders being stuck in limbo.
So you don't want property developers to be able to pass the buck or to remain silent. I mean, there is the issue, isn't there, of companies that no longer exist. And
well, that's what we're trying to address.
Yeah.
You are on the money there, because that's what our levy does. It goes for the wide industry levy, not just the developers, the cladding manufacturers who put flammable material in our homes. It goes for all of those in the case where the developers don't exist. So it really would solve the problem.
Yeah, so it basically pinpoints a company. I mean, is that fair necessarily on constructors, for example, if they just so happen to have worked with a developer that's gone out of business? Developer A that hasn't gone out of business gets the bill, but developer B that's gone out of business, that bill is then passed on to a construction company who worked with them. Is that fair?
Well, we proposed the Polluter Pays Amendment for 14 months, which dealt with this in a much fairer way. And the Earl of Lytton proposed our amendment, and it was voted on, and it was narrowly voted out by a Conservative whip. That would have checked each building and only gone after those responsible, and then had a levy for the rest. That's the fairest way of dealing with the problem. But we aren't, unfortunately, able to do that. So the levy is the next fairest, because you've got to consider the players in this. The leaseholders have been failed by the industry. They are not at fault. The industry itself has benefited from profits, whether they're directly or indirectly responsible for the buildings that we have now in the built environment. They're all profiting from putting flammable cladding on and putting, large amounts of defective material that we've seen all over the country, like missing fire breaks, like internal holes in the walls where it should be sealed. And I think as an industry, there's a culture of cutting corners. And over the 14 months of my campaign, I've talked to loads of people in the industry. It said the culture needs to change. And this levy, although it seems unfair, it's the fairest option other than my Polluter Pays Amendment, which would have done it more fairly.
Yeah, okay. Very quickly, we know that £2 billion for buildings where developers are responsible for them and the developers still around. You say that the 3 billion to rectify work on buildings where the developers cannot be traced isn't enough. Do you know how much is needed?
Well, this is the point. When I say it's not enough, what I mean is it may not be enough, and we need a backstop in case it isn't enough. We don't have the full figures of all the affected buildings in the building safety crisis even now. And what we're trying to do is redesign the backstop so it can cope with cost overruns, with materials going up. You've just talked about inflation reaching a 30-year high. Interest rates are likely to be raised. Everything's going to get more expensive.
Yeah, and you want a little bit of security in there after so many months of wrangling. Appreciate that. Steve Day, founder of the Polluter Pays campaign, commenting on that news on cladding today. Thanks very much, Steve. Good to speak to you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Okay, well, there are growing signs Russia could be on the brink of fully capturing Mariupol.